Welcome to this episode of the Fourscore and Seven Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. And today, our subject is what is possibly the most contentious and controversial topic in America, the immigration crisis. This is part 3. And we will continue with our efforts in this section of the discussion to peel back the bewildering onion layers of this complex and politicized issue to better understand the causes and implications of just what might be the most profound transition of a single civilization because of uncontrolled immigration in almost 2,000 years. We are pleased once again to have as our guest the eminent scholar Jeremy Carl, currently a fellow at the Claremont Institute in Southern California, a past research fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution, and a former Deputy Assistant Secretary with the Department of the Interior. Jeremy is a graduate of Yale University and the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. And he is the author of the best-selling book, The Unprotected Class. Welcome back, Jeremy.
Thanks so much for having me on. It's a pleasure to be with you.
When we ended part 2 of this discussion, we left with the question of what is the celebration parallax. And I want to start part 3 of this discussion with your concept of the celebration parallax. Can you tell us about it?
Yeah, so the celebration parallax is a wonderful term that was invented by one of my Claremont colleagues, Michael Anton. And what it means is that effectively a concept can either be sort of very praiseworthy and true or absolutely false and scandalous that you would even suggest it, depending on who is making the assertion. And so where we see this with respect to immigration is that if I, as a white person and as a conservative, come out and say, hey, America's kind of current ethnic majority is being replaced, and I don't like that, and it's terrible, and I want to put a stop to it, I was told, A, that it's maybe false, and then beyond that, I'll be told, oh, it's racist and terrible for you to even mention it. Whereas I point to in my book any number of times in which members of minority groups have essentially said that exact same thing with a slightly different spin on it, say white majority is dead and we're going to take over and X and Y and Z and similar. And this is often seen as a wonderful praiseworthy thing that is celebrated in the same media that would tell me that if I say it, it's both racist and false.
Well, fascinating. So, and that pretty much defines the limits and the definition of the debate that's going on in this country right now. We have two sides that seem to have no hope of bridging the gap.
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge. And I guess I bring obviously my own biases to this discussion, but this is an unequal polarization. In other words, I don't think that the right has moved like dramatically to the right on immigration issues over the years. If anything, quite the opposite. I think that the mainstream right is kind of made its peace positively or negatively with a lot of immigration that we've had. And interestingly, I don't think that the left-wing voters are anywhere near as radical as the left-wing political leaders, but the left-wing political leaders have just become incredibly radical on this issue. And we've seen this go to its extreme in the Biden administration, where we have literally millions of illegals showing up at our border and being admitted and being flown in at taxpayer expense and being housed and fed at taxpayer expense to the detriment of Americans, and that everybody is supposed to somehow celebrate this. And if I say, as I do believe, that every single one of these people here illegally, and that includes the people with obviously false asylum claims, should be deported, then it's the new Jim Crow in operation or something like that.
So we touched on this briefly in the last episode, but what did Trump do, the Trump administration do to get this under control? Because in the last year, I think, of his administration, the amount of illegal immigrations were down to 800 to 1,000, maybe 1,200 a day, and it's, of course, maybe 14, 15 times that now. What did Trump do to get that under control that Biden unwound that led us to this?
Well, we touched in a previous episode on the Remain in Mexico policy. That was really important. So the idea that when you were pursuing these dubious asylum claims, you couldn't do it from the United States. So that dramatically reduced incentives. Everything they did was just to simply make it more costly in every respect to immigrate here illegally. So they tried to enforce the laws. And it's actually interesting. If we didn't have a left-wing judiciary that was illegally, in my view, flouting the Trump administration's entirely lawful orders on immigration at pretty much every step. As low as Trump got the illegal immigration, he could have gotten it quite a bit lower. And again, I knew a lot of people who were working in the Trump administration on these policies. They were very knowledgeable. They understood what needed to be done. They had sort of been hamstrung by a lot of the left-wing judiciary and the deep state bureaucracy essentially attempting to thwart them. But we could easily, I think, if we had a real concerted effort and if we passed things like E-Verify, which would basically mean that you could only be employed if we could really verify that you were here legally. If we did all these things, if we got much, much more serious about quick deportations of people who we know to be here illegally with less procedural hurdles, we could have gotten illegal immigration down even dramatically further than it went under Trump. But at least under Trump, people who wanted to immigrate here illegally understood that it wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't going to be straightforward. There was never going to be a get out of jail free card. Whereas it's been the exact opposite under Biden. People understand if they come here, they're not going to be deported. They're going to be provided with all sorts of services. So people respond to incentives, right? And again, I'm not even mad at the people who are here illegally that much. I mean, as an American, I don't love it, but I'm not blaming them for trying to better their own situation. What I think is the scandal, and the scandal that should actually be prosecuted, is that our political leaders have allowed this to happen. That's the problem.
You mentioned in your book some of the topics that have become some of the most taboo things to mention or discuss in this country. And these are the subjects of white privilege and the patriarchy. And if someone disputes the fact that there's such a thing as a white privilege or there's such a thing as a patriarchy, they're accused of being a bigot and they're consigned to the cultural gulag, I believe. We also talked last time about the motivations for the current Biden administration for having an open border policy, whether it's to make sure that we have a growing population, because without immigration we're a shrinking population, whether it's to drift the general electorate to the left, or whether it's to replace the culture, which is the so-called replacement theory, again, which people on the left accuse of being racist and bigoted, even replace that there's such a thing as replacement theory. But on this sensitive topic, I think you have gotten a lot of endorsements for your book, and people have said, and well-known people who are very prominent in the public eye, have said that what you've raised and pointed out is courageous, because most people shy away from that. Your thoughts on the propositions that you presented in your book, meaning that you're attacking some of these issues, pushing back against at least the stereotypes that the left of right culture is pushing on the American society?
Well, I'll leave the level of courage up for other people to decide. I'll just certainly have heard that a lot, kind of done the round of interviews. I mean, to me, it was at the end of the day a simple calculus. I've got 5 kids. I'm thinking about their future. I've had certain opportunities in America that are great opportunities because America has been such a great country. I don't want to lose that. I don't want to lose that opportunity for my kids. And so the cost of me speaking out in terms of whatever social group is going to say something nasty about me is trivial in comparison to my concern for my kids and their future. But I should add, it's not just for my kids, it's for everybody's kids. And this includes kids of other races, because the kind of way we're going down, the path we're going down, is one that in other societies has led to all sorts of conflict, particularly in democracies, right? Like, ultimately, when you have dictatorships, you can kind of keep a lid on some of these things sometimes. I mean, not that there's not other problems with dictatorships, but just to kind of pick one trivial example, Marshal Tito kept a lid on all the ethnic tensions in Yugoslavia. And then once he left the scene and communism left the scene, you had huge amounts of ethnic warfare that just blew up everywhere and kind of devastated that entire region. So we're a democracy, and I don't want us to get anywhere near that type of situation. I'm concerned that we are. And so while I had some initial reluctance that I think anybody could understand to kind of take on this topic, eventually I just was sort of in the position where I said, hey, this is a really important topic. Somebody needs to talk about it. I'm qualified to talk about it. I've researched and thought about this for many years. And I guess I'm just going to have to step forward and be that person who's going to do that. And so that's what I did.
Well, let me ask you directly. The concept of white privilege has been adopted wholeheartedly in some areas of the country, is completely rejected in others or among different groups. The same issue with the patriarchy. It's become doctrine in some places, others it's rejected. Do you believe that there is such a thing as white privilege or patriarchy in this country?
White privilege, definitely no. And there was in the past. I talk about this in the book. I mean, when you actually had white privilege in this country, you had a number of things from authors like James Weldon Johnson, who's the wrote "Lift Every Voice and Sing," a song that many people are familiar with. He wrote a book in 1912 called The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man. And it's essentially about a black person of very light skin who's trying to pass for white, because at that time, there really was white privilege in the society. And we can point to all sorts of situations and literary works and reality where that was the case. Today, you have quite the opposite. So if you're talking about how horrible the Chinese dictatorship is, it's a pretty good chance that you actually don't live under it, right? Or if you were in the old Soviet Union and you were complaining a lot, or if you were talking about how terrible the old Soviet Union was, you probably weren't living in it. I mean, of course, there were some dissidents who just went to jail, but it's precisely because those things are no longer operative that it's exactly the opposite, that it's in fact very fashionable to attack whites, to attack white privilege that doesn't really exist anymore. It's because of that that you know that white privilege, in fact, is no longer an operative feature of society, just the opposite. The patriarchy, that's a more complicated question. It doesn't get into my book, but I would say that I'll just leave it at the fact that if you look at sex relations right now and the failure of folks to get married and have families and the declining birth rate, um, perhaps there were some things about the old system, while not perfect in many, many respects, that we should not have just thrown out the baby with the bathwater, and the kind of relentless quest to erase all distinctions between sexes and genders will perhaps not work out so well for society going forward.
Interesting. Well, I know a couple of themes in your book intertwine. One theme, of course, which we've talked about, the uncontrolled immigration, and the other theme that seems to wrap itself around the uncontrolled immigration is this doctrine in the United States, according to your book, of the hostility to the white culture, in particular. And therefore, there's this growing sense of the white culture, or whites being strangers in a strange land, to quote Robert Heinlein's title of his book from the 1960s. And your book expresses some concern that what happens when a culture that is responsible for founding the country and developing its institutions is now a disfavored group within a country, when that group becomes the minority in the country. And you express some concern about that eventuality. Would you elaborate on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you kind of did very nicely. I just think it's a really dangerous situation when you have a bunch of people coming in, and look, you can say whatever you want about America, and America is not sin free, it's not fault free, it never has been. I reject a sort of Whig history that suggests that everything was always just great and getting better. But there are a lot of really great things about America, and there's a reason that people from all over the world are trying to come here and have tried to come here, of all different races, ethnicities, backgrounds, religions. So when we create a sort of system where the group of people whose ancestors sort of came up with that system become marginalized, when that history becomes marginalized and attacked, and we say, hey, we're going to replace it with something else, and often that something else is derived directly or indirectly from countries and cultures that have not have been as successful, and that's precisely the reason why those people are immigrating here. I think that's something that should cause everyone to be very concerned.
Well, it's interesting you should mention that, because you hear that echoed in a lot of the internal domestic migration that's going on in the United States, where people are moving from blue states to red states, and people in red states are saying, don't bring your politics with you. That's the reason you're moving to a red state to begin with.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's a bunch of misconceptions about that also. I mean, one of the interesting things, I think actually in Idaho, they've sort of figured this out, but the Californians who come up to Idaho are on average much more, they're not like liberal Californians, and Montana or places like that. They're much more conservative than the native Idahoans and Montanans on average, even though these groups already were conservative populations. And so the kind of great California emigration has turned these states into being even more conservative. And so sometimes I think the don't bring your politics with you can be misplaced. On the other hand, in some other areas like Colorado, I think more liberal Californians have tended to immigrate there and have brought more liberal frame of politics than the more conservative politics that used to be in California. So in Colorado. So it really does. It's dependent on a state by state basis.
What do you see in terms of governmental policies on immigration? We have what are the formal policies, which say one thing, but then we have the informal policies, which seem to disregard the law, at least as currently implemented by the current Biden administration. What do you see going into the future if you could write the legislation and enforce it as the ideal immigration policy to be put in place in the United States?
I think first we have to create facts on the ground, and I hope that if we get a Trump administration, he will do that. In other words, like you just deport people, and you just dare to kind of challenge that. And I think there's a real, because the left had such a tight control of the bureaucracy and some of the judiciary, they have a great ability to like spin you around on an axle if you engage in those sorts of terms. Whereas if you just create facts, if you just say that's great, here's our legal opinion about why we're just going to deport people and we'll see you in court. Like when you create those facts, that makes a difference. So I think if in adjudicating the difference that you have outlined between the technical law and what's actually going on, I think that's really important. But secondly, I think we just need to totally overhaul hard-seller. We need to go back to a much, much lower immigration numbers. We need to be deporting everybody religiously who is not supposed to be here because they're an unauthorized immigrant of some type. We need to not feel like we need to apologize for that. And we need to reorient our immigration system much less around family unification, a particularly expansive view of family unification, where you bring your grandfather in and then you're bringing a cousin in. If you're going to have family unification, it should be like a parent bringing a child at most. But you really need to focus in on who's bringing skills that America really needs. And I would argue that as a pretty successful society, that's actually a pretty small group of people who really are so uniquely talented that they're kind of bringing something that we don't have in America anyway. Now that's going to be a really ferocious political fight to do any and all of that, but I'm girded up for it. I believe in it. I think if we have any possibility of saving the country going forward, that's really, we're going to have to engage in that struggle, and we're going to have to do so without apology.
So looking at it from the other standpoint, let's say, for example, the Biden administration is reelected and the current open border policies continue for at least another 4 years, and who knows how far beyond that. I think your book is talking about a new North American civilization. What would that hypothetical new civilization look like?
I don't know, but I think it will be a breaking point. I mean, I think the right is at a breaking point where you're going to see maybe a lot of enclavism. That would be the nicest sort of term, where you get groups, not just kind of states really beginning to diverge very substantially politically, but people sort of moving more substantially into their own ethnic communities. That's a better way of keeping harmony than having everybody at each other's throats all the time. But beyond that, you're going to wind up with it'll be kind of a mix of a heavily Hispanic culture with a sort of more traditional Anglo culture, but you're going to have every other group. I mean, the big fertility boom right now, the only place where, even though fertility is falling, it's still far above replacement, is sub-Saharan Africa, which is a very different culture, obviously, not just than America, but even than African Americans. So over time, you'll see that becoming a much bigger part of the U.S. public and U.S. culture. And look, we're just going to have to deal with all of this as best we can. I've put forth my view about what I think would be good for America, and I'm trying to convince other people. I think if you look at the actual public views on immigration right now, they're actually much more aligned with my view than the Biden administration's view. And so we just need to kind of push on that until we can hopefully make some progress and turn things around.
Well, it sounds like what we would be looking at with unlimited, uncontrolled immigration into the indefinite future is clearly loss of social cohesion, even worse than what we have now. What risk do you see to the basic structure of our system of government?
Well, they're huge. I mean, they're existential, and we'll see. I mean, I'm doing everything I can to avoid them. But if we don't get a control of this issue, I think, yeah, I mean, I think the whole U.S. system is up for grabs, and that's going to combine with maybe some debt-related crises that I think are indirectly being caused by issues like this, and things could get really ugly. So let's hope that we don't go in that direction.
Well, I agree with that. You did say one thing as we start drawing to a conclusion, but you said that the proper immigration policy should facilitate the integration into the history, tradition, and of the pre-existing groups of people in this country, and that but many of the immigrants who are already here have declared war on the American European identity. Can you give me some examples of how some of the immigrants who have come to this country recently have declared war on the traditional American identity?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not aware of the exact, you may be paraphrasing because I'm not aware of saying anything quite exactly like that, but I would certainly say that, like, everything you're seeing with statues coming down, which started with Confederate statues, which was predictable, and people like me said at the time, they pick on the sort of most controversial people first, but they won't stop there. And sure enough, we've had in California, among other places, you've had statues of Jefferson come down, statues of Columbus come down, statues of Lincoln come down. So you really are seeing a war by largely the left and its constituent client groups on America's history, culture, and traditions. It's not everybody, I hasten to add, in these groups that's signed up for that, and in fact, quite the opposite, but a politically relevant minority or majority has. And so that's moved these issues in some really unproductive ways.
So how much of that so-called council culture that you're touching upon is attributable, in your opinion, to the uncontrolled immigration?
I think a lot. I think if you hadn't had the sort of hard seller bill, and we had kept a demographics as we'd had in the mid 1960s, these problems would be just dramatically smaller in scope. And you know what? We're not putting that genie back in the bottle. We have to go forward with the society we have. I kind of end my book on this note that even if we wouldn't have started at the place we are, this is where we are. We've got to not kind of pine for some past that's not coming back, but figure out how we can both, all go forward together in the best possible way.
You mentioned also that you already talked about the dramatic slowdown in the rate of immigration, but you also referred to aggressive assimilation. What do you mean by that?
Just, what I think we've talked about a little bit before, that it's just you got to have the culture and institutions of the country aggressively supporting that we're going to teach you about the way that we have done things here that we think is a really successful way. And we want you to adopt that and to not apologize for speaking or thinking in that way.
Well, wonderful. Well, here we are in 2024. Everyone realizes that the status of immigration is one of the top, if not the top issue in this presidential election year. And you've done an excellent job of laying out your position on open border policies of the Biden administration, whether that's good or bad for the country compared to a more restrictive immigration policy of the Trump administration in the past. And if the Trump administration comes up into power, presumably will be the policy of the new Trump administration. So you've laid out the foundation of what the voters in 2024 are confronting. So they will make the choice. And as you say in your book, it is a choice. And if you have unlimited immigration, would we be at risk of becoming a fallen empire, I think is the word that you use, or would we want to follow some other course that will allow us to maintain social cohesion and some type of social consensus and identity, if I said that correctly?
Yeah, I think that's accurate. And again, the book is called The Unprotected Class. You can buy it on Amazon or Barnes and Noble, or hopefully at your local bookstore, although sometimes conservative books don't get as good a hearing there. And if you're interested in what I've said, I hope your listeners will buy the book and read it and profit from it.
Thanks for being with us on this episode of the Fourscore and Seven Project, a production of the New Majority Foundation. My name is Roger Clark, your host. Be sure and like and share us with your friends. I hope you enjoyed and have been informed by this fascinating three-part conversation with Jeremy Carl, a scholar at the Claremont Institute, where the subject of our conversation has been the immigration crisis in America.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.